Good morning. This is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to our bonus Bible study for Thursday, October 22nd, as we lift up this theme in the Bible Project on the art of biblical poetry. Now, before we get into our subject matter, let me just lift up our two goals for this whole Bible project. And the first is that we learn together how to read the Bible better. But our second goal is we're lifting up this resource, this online resource of the Bible Project, so that even after this course, you can go back time and time again, not just to review the material that we've already covered, but they have so much more as far as Bible resources, where they take a look at each of the books of the Bible, they take a look at themes. There's just so much there that I know you're going to enjoy for a long time to come. First, a recap then. What have we covered so far? And I want to lift up, first of all, that the Bible is a unified book. And secondly, they've done a great job in lifting up this library of books as three genres of literature. And so we have narrative, poetry, and discourse, and we've spent the last 2 weeks focusing in on the Bible as narrative. So what's the character of the story? And now we're going to shift, and we're going to take a look at the Bible as poetry. And that's important because a full third of the Bible is poetic in nature. Obviously, if you look at the Psalms, it's all poetry, and you can see the indented line from the beginning to the end. Other books like Isaiah, open it up and turn its pages, and sometimes you have the narrative form or the discursive form, and then other times you see the indents, again, where these important sections are written in poetry. And other times in the Gospels, for example, you have mostly narrative, but every once in a while you'll see poetry inserted. And I think that that's important because the Bible often functions like a musical. Now, this is my language, not the Bible Project's, but it's like a musical. I know that some people love musicals, some people hate musicals, because at key moments, all of a sudden, the characters burst into song. That is the way the Bible is. Often at key moments, the writers burst into song, and for some really good reasons, and that's what we want to review today. In, first of all, the first section, which will be the art of biblical poetry, and then we're going to shift to metaphor in biblical poetry. But first, the art of biblical poetry. Enjoy.
So we've been learning how to read biblical narrative and showing how the Bible is one unified story. But 30% of the Bible is made up of ancient poetry. And I don't know about you, but I don't read a lot of stories where 1 out of 3 pages is some kind of poem.
Yet poetry is everywhere in the Bible. Some biblical books are entirely poetry. Most of the Hebrew prophets wrote masterful poems, and the majority of God's speech in the Bible is represented as poetry. It's also very common in biblical narrative for the story to pause while a character breaks out in poetic song. Like in the Exodus story, there's a narrative about Moses leading the Israelites through the waters of the sea, and that's followed by a beautiful poem about the very same thing.
Why a story and a poem? Wouldn't one version suffice?
Well, poetry has a different purpose than stories. Instead of describing the difference, let's just experience it.
Okay.
So, one part of the story goes like this.
The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through on dry land with a wall of water on their right and on their left.
That seems pretty clear.
Right?
Now the poem, telling the same event.
O Lord, by the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. Surging waters stood like a wall. Deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. Whoa, a wall of surging water, like jello and divine nostrils? This is intense.
Yeah, the poem ignites your imagination through the experience of verbal art. And biblical poets did this with a specific set of tools. And that's what we're going to look at, the art of biblical poetry. The basic unit of any poem is the line. And then many lines are designed together to make a poem.
Okay, I'm used to this kind of poem. There's a meter, cadence, bum, 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 and there's rhyme. But poems in the Bible don't work like this.
Yeah, biblical poems are what you could call free verse. They don't use meter like some traditions of poetry do, and they don't use rhyme in the same way either.
So biblical poems have no order to them.
No, they just have a different kind of order. Biblical poems are most basically structured by couplets, two short lines that are carefully worded and placed beside each other. The first line makes the basic statement, and then the second line develops it in some way. It can do this by completing the thought, or deepening it with different words or images, or by contrasting it in some way. So check out the opening of Psalm 51. You can see it in action. In the first couplet, the poet asks God to show grace and love. But how exactly? In the second line, he requests forgiveness for his failures.
Okay, so this couplet is finishing one complete thought.
Right. And then the next couplet opens with washing as a metaphor, and then the second line offers a more vivid image, that of a priest in the temple purifying things so they can be in God's presence.
Okay, so taking an image and deepening it.
Right. And then this third couplet opens with the poet's awareness of his sin deep inside, and that's followed by a description of the sin being outside. It's like it's in public, visible to themselves and other people.
So this couplet takes an idea and contrasts it.
Exactly.
So couplets by nature are a bit repetitive.
But the repetitive language forces you to slow down and linger over the feeling and meaning of it all, looking at each idea from more than one angle. And then groups of couplets can come together around one key idea. It's like a diamond with many facets, each line offering a different glimpse into the same core reality.
So this poem is exploring what it's like to be forgiven, offered a second chance.
And that's the kind of experience that can change a person. It's worth savoring and pondering. Now, biblical poets also use repetition on a larger scale. In many poems, you'll find a key line that's repeated multiple times. That's called a refrain. Or they'll open and close the poem with a similar couplet. That's called an inclusio.
Now, so biblical poets love design.
Oh yeah, these are works of verbal artistry. These poets use repetition to create all kinds of elaborate patterns that invite the reader to make connections between different parts of the whole poem that open up even deeper layers of meaning.
Cool. So I'm feeling at home with ancient Hebrew poetry.
But remember, poetry isn't something you master and then move on. Biblical poems are a bottomless well. They're packed with a surplus of meaning for those who are willing to slow down and ponder them.
And they're trying to pull my mind in new directions and discover new ideas.
Exactly. And there's even one more tool that biblical poets have to do that very thing, and that's what we'll look at in the next video. You guys, thank you for watching this video on how to read biblical poetry. It's our first video about poetry. We have a lot more in this How to Read the Bible series about how to read other parts of the Bible.
We're a crowd-funded nonprofit, and that means that everything we make, it's free, and it's produced because of the generosity of people like you who watch and pitch in for more. You can see everything we've made on our YouTube channel and at thebibleproject.com.
Thanks, you guys.
Now, I love the section that we just saw because poetry slows us down, doesn't it? And it's like we're looking at a diamond. And if we take that diamond and turn it and turn it and turn it again, we see different colors and shapes. And that's what poetry does for us. It tells the biblical story, slows us down, and allows us to view the gospel story from these various angles in a very artistic way. But now we want to move to the use of metaphor in this poetry. And they're quick to say, metaphors, well, that's just how our minds work. That's how our imaginations work. Using different images and linking them to other aspects of our lives and the stories that are all around us. So we want to listen now to this section on metaphor. And remember, what we're doing with this section and the one before it is we're preparing for next week, where we will talk about the Psalms. But now, metaphor in biblical poetry. Enjoy.
So we're learning how to read biblical poetry, which makes up over 30% of the Bible.
Yeah, poetry is a way of writing that doesn't just communicate information. It invites us to experience ideas with our imaginations, using creative imagery, or what we would call metaphorical language.
All right, let's talk about imagery and metaphor in biblical poetry.
So, some things in life are easy to understand because they're tangible, physical experiences, like being cold.
Yeah, being cold is no fun.
But other experiences aren't as concrete, like when somebody doesn't like you.
But that's no fun either.
So, two very different things, but notice how your mind has linked them together without you knowing it. So when we say things like, she gave me the cold shoulder, or don't be so cold.
You could also flip it around and think of affection as warmth. It took him a while to warm up to me, or she's a warm person.
Exactly. So we take a basic concept, like warmth, and then we map it onto an abstract concept, like affection. It gives us a more imaginative way to talk about our experiences.
We're thinking in metaphors.
Yeah, they provide the framework for how our minds make sense of the world. Metaphors govern all of our thinking and language.
Like right there, metaphors govern. That's a metaphor in and of itself, saying that ideas are rulers.
Or think about a connected metaphor that competing ideas are at war.
Yeah, in a debate, I have to defend my position and provide backup so I could win the argument.
And so you can see, metaphors aren't just a fancy way of writing, they're everywhere in our language. And the metaphors we use shape our imaginations and our behavior. And so it's no surprise that the biblical poets constantly use metaphorical imagery.
Now, some metaphors in the Bible are easy to understand, like light is good and darkness is bad.
But remember, the biblical poets lived in an ancient culture, which means that some of their metaphors might seem kind of strange to us.
Like what?
Okay, so picture chaotic water, like a deep, stormy ocean.
Got it.
Now, think about a time you were in danger, and then map those two onto each other, and...
Danger is like chaotic waters.
Right, and then the biblical authors take it further. They also talk about dangerous people as stormy waters, like in Psalm 69. Save me, O God, for the waters are up to my throat. I've entered the deep waters. My enemies outnumber the hairs of my head.
Oh, the enemies are dangerous waves.
Yes, and so are enemy nations. Like in Isaiah 17, woe to the nations that rage like the raging, roaring seas. Or in Psalm 89, O Lord, you rule the swelling seas. You scatter enemies with your mighty arm.
So this is a basic metaphor for danger and chaos in our world. But God has the power over chaotic waters.
Right. And this foundational image is so important, it's introduced on page 1 of the Bible.
Oh, right. The uncreated world in Genesis 1 is a dark, chaotic ocean that God brings order to.
Exactly. The image begins there and then develops throughout the rest of the Bible, and so does its opposite. If chaotic water is a fundamental image of danger, think about what dry land would represent.
Dry land would be safety, security, stability.
Exactly. Some of the most basic human desires. And that is what God's providing when the dry land appears in the opening pages of Genesis.
And this is also where God plants the Garden of Eden.
And it's no average garden. It's described with imagery of an ancient temple, high above those dangerous waters. And then from this garden temple flows a river that waters everything.
So the human ideal is to be with God in a mountain garden temple.
Yes, this image permeates biblical poetry. Like when David celebrates God's presence in the temple in Psalm 65.
How blessed is the one who's satisfied with goodness in your temple. A stream of God waters the land. You still the roaring of the waves and the turmoil of the nations.
Now watch. Because the temple was associated with being close to God's presence, this high rock could become a metaphor for God himself. Like in Psalm 18, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer.
And that's the image Jesus is drawing on when he says that listening to him is like building your house on the rock.
Exactly. And so notice how these rich metaphors in biblical poetry are rooted in images from earlier biblical narratives. That's how metaphors work in the Bible. You need the narratives to understand the poetic images, and the images reveal deeper meaning in those narratives.
Cool. Now, the largest collection of poetry in the Bible is the book of Psalms.
And learning how to read the book of Psalms, that's what we'll talk about next.